Okay, so you saw what an amazing discovery that was. And uh, the tomb was nearly intact. It looked like there's probably robbers soon after Tut was buried there, but they were stopped and scared off, and the tomb was resealed. And as you're going to see when we look at the treasures, it was a pretty remarkable find, especially because Tutankhamun died when he was only 18. He didn't accomplish very much in his life, and that actually explains also some of the tomb as well. So you saw that Howard Carter, right, poked a hole through the seal, and Lord Carnarvon asked him if he could see anything, and he said yes, wonderful things. The first chamber was just crammed full of beds covered in gold and two chariots and boxes and all sorts of things. Because Tut died young, his tomb was not ready, and they actually had to use another tomb, a tomb that was not designed for a pharaoh, and it was actually on the small side. So things were crammed in there with really hardly any room to spare as a result. Right. So this was that first chamber. So you saw them go down into the chamber over here, right, and they explored around, and then there was another chamber back here, and then the burial chamber. So these photos show a little bit what it was like as they started to explore, and then as they started to carefully remove the contents over 10 years. It took 10 years for Howard Carter and the team to take all of the objects out, catalog them, preserve them, and send them to the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. But you can see the beds here, all sorts of different kinds of beds that he was bringing, two disassembled chariots that he would have used in war, and you can see what they would have looked like once they were fully assembled. Throne showing he and his wife, who is also his, I believe, his half sister. That was not unusual. The royal line went through the female line, and because the pharaoh was a god, they were essentially imitating Osiris and Isis. These are two statues representing the Ka of Tut and the burial chamber. And you can see this is where Howard Carter covered up the hole that he made in order to explore there early before anyone knew, and then covered his tracks. They had an official opening of that sealed chamber. You can see them breaking through. This is Lord Carnarvon. There's Howard Carter. One of the things that they found immediately was that the wooden shrines covered in gold were crammed into this tiny space in there, and there was barely any room to navigate around them, right? So you can see this burial chamber is very small, and the shrines that held the coffin barely fit inside there. When they started to open up the shrine, they saw that the door was sealed with the necropolis seal of the priests, and they knew that the contents inside were preserved. We'll look at the wall paintings, but you could see the wall paintings of King Tut and a little bit on top of the shrines. These gold-covered shrines, there were several of them, encompassing the stone sarcophagus. You can see here's Howard Carter working on taking apart the shrine so they could be removed one by one. Now, in this painting, you probably recognize who this god is. This is Osiris, and this is King Tut embracing Osiris. But in the next scene, it's King Tut as Osiris, because he becomes Osiris, and the next pharaoh is doing the opening mouth ceremony on his mummy. Right? So as these gold shrines were taken apart, they revealed a stone sarcophagus on the inside. So there was a gold-covered shrine with another gold-covered shrine, another gold-covered shrine, another gold-covered shrine, a stone sarcophagus, a gold-covered wooden sarcophagus, another gold-covered wooden sarcophagus, a solid gold sarcophagus, and then the body of King Tut with the solid gold death mask, right? So again, remember that he is a minor pharaoh, and just look at the sheer amount of treasure. As they start opening the coffins, here's the gold-covered wooden coffin. They started to uncover, you can see here, the solid gold coffin. It's pretty amazing. I've seen the treasures in the Cairo Museum. It's pretty amazing to see a coffin that is solid gold, filled in with beautiful blue stone and red carnelian. It's pretty amazing. The sheer amount of gold, though, is incredible. So here's the sarcophagus, and then the famous gold death mask that was on Tutankhamun's mummy. His mummy bandages were filled with all sorts of protective amulets, and after unwrapping everything, they finally revealed the body of King Tut himself. And that wasn't all, because next to the burial chamber was yet another chamber. This had a Anubis kind of portable shrine, and behind, in this gold-covered wooden box, were the canopic jars that held the internal organs of King Tut. Right? Now, soon after Tut's finding, Lord Carnarvon actually cut himself shaving in Cairo and got blood poisoning and died soon after the burial chamber was opened. And newspapers that didn't have access to the story of the archaeological expedition, only one newspaper had exclusive rights to print what was found, and then all the other newspapers had to print it a day later, a couple days later. They came up with a new story after Lord Carnarvon died, and they came up with this idea that there was a curse on King Tut, and so anyone remotely connected to the dig who had any sort of strange things happen to them or died from anything, it was all chalked up to the curse story, which was just basically fabricated. But this excavation also inspired a whole new crop of mummy movies. So the most famous one after the finding of King Tut was only 11 years after Tut was discovered. Boris Karloff played the mummy, you can see here. So after the excavation of Tut's tomb, many people thought there would be nothing left to find the Valley of the Kings, but that of course was wrong. The more exploration they did, the more they found. Nothing quite like King Tut in terms of preservation, but in 1995 they found a very large tomb complex for the sons of Ramses II by his many wives. They also found something called KV63. All the finds in the Valley of the Kings get a KV number, Kings Valley, and then basically just a random number assigned to it. But this turned out to be a mummification chamber where mummies were prepared. Okay, we're going to do a little bit of a tour through Egyptian history now, and we're going to sort of look at the overall trends, but you won't have to get too focused on all the different pharaohs. We'll mention a few, but we'll pay attention to maybe a couple that are more familiar to many people, right? But when we look at Egyptian history, it's like the history we've seen in Mesopotamia and other places, where there's an overall trajectory from small societies to larger societies, less complex to more complex, right? So in Mesopotamia, we went from chiefdoms to one state to many city-states and then to an empire. In Egypt, we have a similar kind of process, starting with the Old Kingdom, right? The Old Kingdom collapses. We'll talk a little bit about its collapse. That's something that we'll also discuss the last week of class. But the Old Kingdom collapses, and when these kingdoms face a collapse, Egyptologists refer to the periods of kind of weakness and disunity as intermediate periods until the next rise of Egyptian culture. So the next one was the Middle Kingdom. They faced a collapse that we'll look at. That's the second intermediate period, and then there's the New Kingdom. Right? Okay, when we look at the Old Kingdom, right, there wasn't a lot of internal warfare in in the Old Kingdom because this was one unified state as opposed to Mesopotamia. There were peoples that they had to fight around them, but not too many. And if you had to predict who who would have developed the greater military technology, Egypt or Mesopotamia, you probably would predict Mesopotamia because all the constant warfare led to new innovations in war and weapons. And with the Egyptians, there wasn't that need. So they got by for quite a while with an army that looked like this. No helmets, no armor, soldiers with spears and shields. While in Mesopotamia, and also in Syria and the Levant here, they were developing new bows, the horse-drawn chariot, bronze armor, all sorts of new weapons. And you could probably figure out what eventually happened. That wasn't until later, though. The Old Kingdom collapses around the same time as the Akkadian Empire, a little bit after the Akkadian Empire. And archaeologists have looked at environmental data and have seen that there probably was a drought at this period, and it might be related to the drought that spelled the end of the Akkadian Empire. So maybe a very large drought eventually caused the end of the Akkadian Empire and the Old Kingdom of Egypt. But it's not as simple as that because there are other things going on as well. What they saw, looking at Egyptian history, is that over the reign of one pharaoh, Pepi I, who reigned something like 70 years, he was one of the longest reigning pharaohs in history. You would think, well, a pharaoh rules for a long time is a good thing. But actually it's not, because over time the pharaoh started to weaken, his power weakened, and governors underneath him started to become wealthy and more powerful. So it was a little bit of disintegration from within, as well as the drought, that probably spelled the end of the Old Kingdom. Well, what about the Middle Kingdom? Well, in the Middle Kingdom, again, this was, around 1700 BC. The Egyptians had got by with this kind of military technology, while in this part, Mesopotamian Syria and the Levant, people got very good with all new kinds of weapons, and you could predict what might have happened. What happened is that a group from this area came in and invaded the northern part of Egypt and conquered that area and ruled over that area for a couple hundred years. These people were known as the Hyksos. Hyksos basically is an Egyptian, I think it's a Greek term that's borrowed from Egyptian that means shepherd kings or foreign rulers. Right? To the Egyptians, the Hyksos were foreigners. They were foreigners who came in and conquered the northern part of Egypt. So you can be pretty sure that the Egyptians were going to do all they could to kick out the Hyksos. And that's exactly what happened. And in fact, one pharaoh, you can see here on his mummy, died fighting the Hyksos. These severe gash wounds to his mummy were probably inflicted in battle. Right? But then to prevent this from happening again, the Egyptians had to come up with a plan, right? That is, if you have these strong city-states here in Canaan that could launch raids into Egypt, what do? I've asked this question to many classes, and sometimes people say, well, what about the Egyptians building a wall across their frontier? And that might have worked. That would take quite an effort to build a wall. But it might have worked to keep people out, but it would still allow people to get pretty close to the heartland of Egypt. Are there any other things that the Egyptians could have done? What they decided to do was to actually invade this area and make it part of a new Egyptian empire. So the new kingdom after that second intermediate period is a period of Egyptian empire. This is the period of King Tut and Ramses II, who we'll look at. What the Egyptians did was to weaken all of these city-states here and make sure that they were not strong enough to invade Egypt, and also rule over the territory with Egyptian governors. They also invaded parts to the south where the Nubian civilization was, which we'll talk about in a couple of weeks. Right? So they created an empire. And as they were creating their empire, another empire was growing, and that was the empire of the Hittites. And you could kind of predict what happened. These two empires went to war. And where did they go to war? Right here where the two empires met, at a battle near a city called Kadesh. Okay, well, let's take a look at some major pharaohs of the New Kingdom. We won't go into too much detail, but give you a little idea of the New Kingdom, the period of empire of ancient Egypt. Hatshepsut is a very interesting pharaoh because this pharaoh was a woman. And after her husband, who was pharaoh, died, rather than serving as a regent and having the young son crowned pharaoh, she decided to be crowned pharaoh and wore all the symbols of power, including the pharaonic beard, built a number of temples in Egypt. And then when she died, her stepson became pharaoh, Thutmose III. Thutmose III is known to many Egyptologists as the Napoleon of ancient Egypt because he was a brilliant general. He ended up fighting a major battle at a city in ancient Canaan called Megiddo. Mound of Megiddo is Har Megiddo, which is where we get our term Armageddon. After him, another famous pharaoh that ruled was Akhenaten. You can see Akhenaten over here, and his wife. This is a very famous piece of Egyptian art. This is the bust of Nefertiti, the wife of Akhenaten. Akhenaten is sometimes called the heretic pharaoh because he changed the Egyptian religion during his reign. It was changed quickly back after his death because it upset the status quo of Egypt. But he focused worship on a sun god called Aten, and here you can see which is why Aten is part of his name, and you can see the solar rays with the Ankh symbol, which means life, shining down on Nefertiti, Akhenaten, and their children, right? And you can see him worshiping Aten here. The priests of the traditional gods, like Amun, were not happy at all with this change. So his son, who became pharaoh, was Tutankhaten, long life to Aten, and he changed his name to Tutankhamun, long life to Amun, to symbolize that the religion had changed back to the way it was before. Right? So Tutankhamun did not live a very long time. He did not get to do much during his reign, but he's known today because of his tomb. Okay, after Tutankhamun, and probably the height of the Egyptian empire was under Ramses II, who I'm sure many of you have heard of the name Ramses. Ramses went to war against the Hittite Empire when the Hittites took a city called Kadesh. He marched his army up from Egypt all the way, you can see, to that frontier to fight the Hittite army. When he marched out, right, and set up camp, the rest of his army was making their way up, right? So the army was kind of staggered. The Egyptian army met two Bedouin. The Bedouin said that the Hittite army had actually retreated because they were so scared to hear that the Egyptians were coming. So Ramses and the Egyptians kind of relaxed a little bit. And then the Egyptians found two Hittite spies. And you can see here they're beating them. And what they learned from the spies is that actually the Hittite army didn't retreat. They were waiting behind the city of Kadesh to launch an attack on Ramses. And at pretty much that moment, the Hittite army launches an attack, runs right through the camp of Ramses, and it looks like Ramses and the Egyptian army is going to be defeated. But what happened is that ancient soldiers were usually paid in what they could loot. When the Hittites felt like they were winning, A lot of the soldiers started to loot the dead bodies of the Egyptian soldiers. This allowed Ramses to launch a counterattack. So he was able to destroy many of the Hittite chariots, and the end result was actually a draw. The battle turned into a draw. Neither the Hittites nor the Egyptians could really claim at that point a victory over each other in terms of that battle. But that, of course, didn't stop Ramses from bragging that he won, right? And usually showing himself on the tombs, in his chariots, marching over the Hittites, as you can see here. So even though he bragged about this battle, which was fought early in his reign, the main importance of the battle was that these two empires signed a peace treaty and ushered in about 60 years of peace between these two empires. And that is really the lasting effect of the battle during Ramses' reign. Two copies of this peace treaty, one was found in Egypt, one was found in the Hittite capital. There's actually a replica of the treaty in the United Nations building, and it says First Peace Treaty in History, which is pretty much correct. And Ramses married a Hittite princess and cemented good relations between the two empires. And then for the remainder of Ramses' reign, he still had something like 60 years, he went on a massive building project, building temples, where he showed his military exploits. One of his most famous buildings, well, here's one I should show you first. This is another temple at Luxor, but one of his most famous constructions is Abu Simbel in the very southern part of Egypt. And what is shown here is 4 statues of Ramses, right, as Horus, as a living god, and inside are wall paintings showing his defeat of the Hittites. And then at this very back chamber are seated 4 gods. There's the god Ptah, the god Amun, Ramses, and Ra. And on one day of the year, the day when Ramses ascended the throne, was crowned Pharaoh of Egypt, the sun shines down the entryway and it lights up the gods in the back chamber. And that was deliberate. They deliberately constructed the temple so that the sun would light up those figures on that specific day. And Ramses died at a ripe old age, probably in his 80s or early 90s. And just like Pepi II, it actually was a weak point after Ramses. So it's actually not such a great thing to have one ruler ruling for an extremely long time. But he's probably one of the most pharaohs in Egyptian history, famous for his building projects and famous for that significant battle against the Hittite Empire. Obviously, Egyptian history continues long after this, up until the period of the Roman Empire, right? So for at least another 1,000 years at this point, right? And so from about 3100 BC to about 30 BC, so for really over 3,000 years, you have an unbroken chain of Egyptian culture, history, language, right? Obviously, there are changes throughout that time, but you have a real consistency in the history, and it's quite amazing to think about that history over such a long period of time. Okay, so this is what will conclude this week's material, Mesopotamia and Egypt. Next week, we're going to start with the ancient civilizations of India, and we will also start to take a look at Central America and South America. Have a good rest of your